Bienvenue à tous. My name is Megan McCarroll from the Association of American Women in Europe. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second talk in the much anticipated new series, The Great Churches of Paris, the evolution of the church and ecclesiastical architecture in Paris from the Middle Ages to today with Russell Kelley. Following the success of the Grands Châteaux of the Loire and Ile-de-France and the making of the French Garden series of online talks, Russell Kelley spent the summer visiting the most beautiful churches of Paris. Our curator extraordinaire returns to offer 6 talks replete with information about another important pillar of France's cultural and architectural heritage, the extraordinary variety of churches that were built in every commune in France, especially in Paris, over the past 1,000 years. So today we'll learn about the Gothic churches of the late Middle Ages with La Sainte-Chapelle, a shining example. But before we get started, let me just tell you a little bit about the Association of American Women in Europe. Our association was founded in 1961 and is a bicultural community of American women, primarily in France and also in Europe. We offer activities for all stages of life, both personally and professionally. We foster an environment that enables our members to create bonds, develop supportive networks, and lifelong friendships. We're a nonprofit volunteer association and a member of the Federation of American Women's Clubs overseas. I'd also like to mention that the series is possible thanks to the Alliance Française de Chicago and the Alliance Française de Miami Metro, and the support of their communication partners, the Federation Alliance Française USA, the French Heritage Society, and the Foundation Le Sauvegarde de l'Art Français. A few words about Russell. Russell Kelley is the curator and moderator of the past 2 winters Zoom lecture series on the Grand Châteaux in Loire and Ile-de-France and the making of the French Garden. He has lived in Paris for 30 years and is the author of The Making of Paris, the story of how Paris evolved from a fishing village into the world's most beautiful city. À vous, Russell.
Merci, Megan, and welcome to everyone. Today will be the second of our series of 6 lectures. Last week, we talked about the Romanesque churches in Paris, and this year we'll visit what has been called the Age of Cathedrals, which overlaps the High Gothic period, the High Middle Ages, and the Late Middle Ages. We will start by defining the key elements of Gothic architecture, and then describe the Gothic cathedrals and churches in Paris and beyond. But please keep in mind that the Gothic style was around for nearly 400 years, and many of these churches and cathedrals took hundreds of years to complete, and many of them were built and rebuilt. So it's actually quite difficult to find a particular, a single church or cathedral that is built in one style. Most of them reflect various styles as they evolved over time. So let me share my screen. And off we go. So we are going to see how the design of churches evolved from the Romanesque style represented by this basilica in Toulouse to the Gothic style represented by the Cathedral of Notre-Dame in Paris. Last week, we talked about the Romanesque style, meaning that it was derived from the Romans. So it was more or less the style was imported from Rome and the Roman Empire. The Gothic style, on the other hand, is a French style. It was developed in France and then exported to other countries in Europe, including Italy. It was originally known as French work, but around 1500, the Italians dubbed this new French work as Gothic, and it was not a compliment because they were contrasting their more sophisticated new Renaissance style of architecture with what they considered to be the barbaric style of Germanic Gothic architecture. Le Corbusier famously said that the history of architecture is the history of the struggle for light. And when it comes to the Gothic architecture, it is really the struggle for light and height. And we will be examining in detail these key elements that characterize Gothic architecture: pointed arches, sometimes ribbed vaults, flying buttresses, and rose windows, and related elements. These we will see a lot. But Gothic architecture, as I said, it evolved over nearly 400 years. So again, we will get into the details of each of these words. But the first, it went from early Gothic with sexpartite rib vaults and 4 elevations, we'll get into that, to high Gothic with quadripartite rib vaults and 3 level elevations, to Rayonnant Gothic, all which means radiating, radiant, where the rose window really came into the fore, as did larger and more windows, and grisaille became popular to allow more light to enter, and there was more decoration in and around the cathedral. And finally, the last phase was Flamboyant Gothic. It gets the name flamboyant from the flame-like tracery around the windows, and in particular, the rose windows and the much more elaborate decoration on the cathedrals. The shape of the church really didn't change that much from the Romanesque to the Gothic. It's still the cruciform style, the Latin cross style. But if you look at some of the details here, you will see that in the Romanesque church, the nave has what we discussed last week, these transverse arches and barrel vaults at the end of the Romanesque period. Although at the end of the Romanesque period in the aisles, they had the first quadripartite 4-part vaults. And you can see from this image of the Gothic church, the typical plan of a Gothic church, there are quadripartite vaults in both the aisles on the sides and in the nave in the center. So what we'll do as a starting point is to explain how church architecture evolved from Romanesque to Gothic, from rounded arches and barrel vaults to pointed arches and ribbed vaults. Barrel vault, as this illustration shows, placed weight evenly on the wall. There's the original churches had, earliest churches had wooden ceilings, but then they developed barrel vaults, stone ceilings that didn't catch on fire so easily. And they were extremely heavy, and they pressed downward and especially outward with great force, great weight. And to counterbalance that, and it was evenly distributed across the whole wall. Therefore, the entire wall had to be very thick in order to counterbalance that weight. And it had to be supported, reinforced by buttresses on the outside of the wall. And because the walls had to be thick, they could only have very small windows. The rib vault, on the other hand, is kind of like a skeleton. It had pointed arches and intersecting ribs. And the result was that the weight of the roof was concentrated on the ribs and on the pointed arches and directed downward to the vertical piers and columns. As we will see, in the early Gothic period, the first churches had sexpartite vaults over 2 bays in the nave, and the high and Rayonnant Gothic churches had quadripartite vaults over 1 bay. So this is a picture of a Romanesque church with its quadripartite 4-part rib vaults over 1 bay. The idea was that it was a square, and so it was quite simple, and aisles were quite narrow. Therefore, it was the shape between the pillars and the aisle was square. But it wasn't the case in the nave. The nave was much wider than the aisles, and so if you wanted to create this square shape, you couldn't do it over just one bay. And therefore, they developed something called the six-part rib vault over two bays in order to create, as you can see here, a square with 6 different panels in it, covering 2 different arches. This resulted in an unequal distribution of weight on strong and weak pillars, which turned out to be a disadvantage in terms of both stability and the ability to build high. In fact, the simpler to construct and more efficient structure was the quadripartite 4-part rib vault with 2 intersecting arches, which allowed the weight to fall equally on 4 identical pillars. So in the high-end Rayonnant Gothic style, the design moved from the sexpartite approach over 2 ribs to a quadripartite rib vault over a single bay. It was more stable, it was easier to build, and crucially, it enabled the ceilings to be higher. So you had another key element were the development in Gothic architecture of flying buttresses. The Romanesque churches had exterior buttresses. The Gothic ones had flying buttresses. Exterior buttresses were just reinforced along the wall outside the church, whereas flying buttresses were actually literally supporting the walls, and you can see here all the way up to the very high level through the use of flyers. The walls and flying buttresses transferred the thrust down and outwards. Arches or flyers led from the walls, and they were again where the pillars were on the walls to piers. There were to piers or buttresses, which would transfer the weight down. And here is a photograph of the chevet of Notre-Dame with pinnacles on top of the piers, which not only were decorative, but they were actually placed there because that additional weight stabilized the piers. So in early Gothic, as I mentioned, we had sexpartite vaults, and the elevation, which we'll talk about, which is how high, how many stories was the inside of the nave of the church. It was 4 levels. And in high Gothic, it was reduced, the elevation was reduced to 3 levels, providing more space for windows. Here is an illustration of a 4 elevation nave. At the bottom, you have the aisle. Above it, you have the tribune or gallery, which is literally over the aisle, the entire width of the aisle. Above that, you have the triforium, which is a much smaller gallery, which maybe doesn't certainly go over the entire aisle. And the top level is called the clerestory, which is where the windows were. This gives you a photograph of it from one of the earliest Gothic cathedrals in Laon in the north of France. The 3-story elevation eliminated the tribune. So there is no longer the tribune directly over the side aisle. There is, however, the triforium and the clerestory, and by eliminating that one level, it meant that the windows of the clerestory could be that much higher. And the other thing that happened in the change from Romanesque to Gothic is the decoration, which was extremely simple during the Romanesque period, became increasingly elaborate as the Gothic period evolved. So this just compares the rather austere Romanesque facade of the Church Saint-Lazare d'Autun with the high Gothic facade of Notre-Dame. on the right. And you can see that it's obviously got more decoration. And similarly, the early Romanesque churches were decorated with mosaics, spectacular mosaics, as at the Romanesque Church of San Vitale, Basilica in Ravenna. And instead of the use of mosaics in Gothic churches, that is when stained glass windows came into their own, particularly at Chartres Cathedral, which we'll talk about later. And Gothic churches also developed the rose window, thanks to the use of vaults and pointed arches and falling buttresses. The walls could be much thinner and they could have more windows in between them. And so while the earliest facades, this is the western facade, the entrance of Saint-Denis Basilica, now they were able to put in a rose window, and rose window similarly went through changes, and this is the first rose window in a western facade in the shape of a wheel with 12 spokes. And that was another early stained glass or rose window called une rosace in French, was at the Rayonnant Cathedral in the shape of medallions. It really, the rose window reached its peak in the Rayonnant period, where Rayonnant gets its name from the radiating spokes of the rose windows, which were truly spectacular. And then the final one is the flamboyant shape, where you can see very clearly here the flame-like shape of the tracery and the windows of the Amiens Cathedral. So in and around Paris, we have Gothic churches that illustrate all of these styles. And none of them, except the Sainte-Chapelle, represents purely one style, the Rayonnant style. So keep that in mind. So we're going to start with the Basilique de Saint-Denis, which is about 6 miles north of Paris. You'll recall from last week that it was established by Dagobert in 632, but then Pepin le Bref and his son Charlemagne replaced Dagobert's church with a Romanesque church in 775. Then we fast forward 400 years nearly to the abbot of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, Suger, who rebuilt in 2 phases the church, the Romanesque church. The first rebuilding involved the west facade, which is sometimes known as the west work, and the choir, which includes the apse and the ambulatory inside the apse at the east end of the church. And you can see from this photograph this image, that the facade of Saint-Denis, the west work, the west facade of Saint-Denis, actually bears some pretty good resemblance to the Abbey Church of Saint-Étienne-de-Caen in a Romanesque style. It does have 3 portals, it does have 4 buttresses, but it's a pure, more elegant style of architecture, and it includes tympanums above the 3 portals, jam statues, and a rose window for the very first time. Originally, the north tympanum was in mosaic, but later was replaced with statuary. And you see these columns on either side of the portal, and those originally had statues on them like this. The very first rosace. It happened to have 12 spokes, this wheel, to represent the zodiac. but it now is a clock, perfect for a clock. On the right, facing west, the west end, the choir, the apse, was rebuilt by Suger as well. And as you can see here, it's got 3 levels: arcades, triforium, and clerestory. That's looking at the choir, with a double ambulatory, which is a passageway around the choir, between the choir and the apsidal chapels. And then a good deal later, after Abbé Suger had was long gone, I think he died around 1147. The in between the bits that had been built by Suger were rebuilt in the Rayonnant Gothic style. It had gone from Early Gothic, they skipped the High Gothic, and now it's the Rayonnant Gothic style. So the nave and the transept reflect that style. Before the rebuilding, it probably looked something like this, with its big heavy columns. It's, as you can see, it's got a flat roof. It does have 2 levels, just the arcades, and above it a clerestory with windows, but nothing huge, and certainly not high. So that nave was totally rebuilt in the Rayonnant Gothic style with quadripartite vaults. They skipped the sexpartite vaults that we discussed earlier of the early Gothic phase, and they went straight to quadripartite vaults. Very high arcades, small triforium, and a clerestory with magnificent stained glass windows. Clerestory in French, claire-voie. The north transept window bears no resemblance to the earliest western facade wheel-shaped window. In fact, this one was built in the 19th century because the original was destroyed during the Revolution in order, believe it or not, to use the lead between the panes of glass to make bullets. Saint-Denis is famous as the royal necropolis. Last week we mentioned that Saint-Germain-des-Prés is where many of the Merovingian kings were built, while starting with the Carolingian kings, or actually Dagobert was still a Merovingian king. He was the first king to be buried there, and it went right through Louis XVIII. And there's Dagobert's tomb, which was remade, and just an illustration of some of the other rather spectacular tombs that are in the nave and transept. The abbey of the 17th century respects the conventual quadrangle that we mentioned last week with the Abbé de Jumièges. This is a wonderful photo from the or etching from the 19th century, which shows the north tower where the arrow is pointing, which is no longer there. And I'll explain a little bit why. It was struck by lightning. A new tower went up, but it was unstable. Therefore, it had to be dismantled in 1847 and was never replaced. The next Gothic cathedral built was Notre-Dame, the very second Gothic church built in the world. And it was built by the Bishop of Paris, Sully. And it took a long time to build. In fact, a little bit, but unlike Saint-Denis, this was built as from scratch. They weren't rebuilding a Romanesque church as they did at Saint-Denis. But while it was taking so long to build, they actually rebuilt parts of it. So the west facade was actually built in the High Gothic style. The clerestory also was built in the High Gothic style, but originally, but then it was rebuilt in the new Rayonnant style that I just described, as was the transept and the rose windows. like most Gothic cathedrals, like most churches, but not all, well, certainly all churches of that period were built facing east, as we discussed last week, called orientation, they were built facing east towards Jerusalem. And in fact, when they were constructed, they started building it at the east end and they finished with the western facade. That was the last thing to go up, often a century later. You see here the very small square in front of Notre-Dame, and you also see that it was painted. The statuary was painted. This is true on the outside of the church, and it was true in the inside of the church. As time went on during the Middle Ages, painting statuary fell out of place, but you can still find, and they ceased painting or repainting statues, although in some places, particularly on the interior, you can see remnants of traces of paints still on statues. In order to access the site, Archbishop Sully built a new road leading to the small parvis for the construction. Ultimately, all of the buildings on either side were torn down by Haussmann, but the trace of the Rue Neuve was left outlined in light-colored stones, so you can see where it once was. The west facade, as I said, classic high Gothic style. At the bottom, the three portals, the west portals, topped by a gallery of kings, topped by the rose window, topped by the colonnade, topped by the Grande Galerie, and the towers. On the left, you have what I call the austere style of Gothic. Well, it was austere for Gothic, not by comparison with Romanesque. And on the right, you have an example of the Rayonnant style that followed the high Gothic style at Reims. And you can see just at a glance how much more elaborate the decoration is on the west facade of Notre-Dame de Reims. Arc-boutants, flying buttresses at Notre-Dame, allowed thinner walls and larger windows. These are the arc-boutants, the early flying buttresses of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and you can see how much cruder they were than the really beautifully elegant ones at Notre-Dame. When I look at this, believe it or not, I am somewhat reminded of the Pompidou Center, because on the Pompidou Center, everything inside is empty. There are no pipes or anything. All the pipes are outside the Pompidou Center. And here, the inside of the Gothic cathedrals is pretty pristine, but all of the supports are on the outside. A great image from the bird's eye view map of Paris of 1739, the Plan de Turgot. And we will talk about Notre-Dame in detail in 3 weeks with the 4 weeks. And I will be accompanied by Michel Picot, who will tell us all about the restoration works. So now I'm going to quickly go through the other high Gothic period cathedrals that were built in that same period. These are cathedrals, the period of the age of cathedrals, cathedrals of unprecedented height, size, and light. Chartres, the fifth church built on this site. Notre-Dame was the third church built on in Paris, largely rebuilt in the high Gothic style. But the west, by the time they got to the west front, or the west front was in the early Gothic style, and the south tower is in the early Gothic style, but the north tower is in the flamboyant Gothic style. So the piers actually connect with the flyers, and sometimes they connect in turn with buttresses that are attached to the outside of a wall. reinforcing interior columns, allowing more space for windows between them. So at Chartres, we have a three-story elevation, clerestory on the top, triforium and arcade, four-part rib vaults connected by colonnettes to pillars below, creating clustered columns that go all the way to the bottom. Quite dramatic. The nave is longer and higher than Notre-Dame de Paris. Chartres is famous for many things, but perhaps nothing more than its stained glass windows, because it has by far the largest number of 13th century medieval stained glass windows. 152 of the original 176 survive. And this was the golden age also of stained glass. And how do you make stained glass? Well, the first process was called pot metal glass, where metallic elements, iron oxide for red, cobalt for blue, would be mixed with molten glass in order to create one of 6 colors in the Middle Ages. And depending on the temperature of the molten glass and how long you would blend them and heat them would determine the color. And it was a very artisanal method, which therefore was affected by many impurities of metals, the thickness of the glass, bubbles, etc., all of which made the stained glass unique and uniquely colorful. You would then cut the colored or stained glass with a diamond, paint details on it, and then bake it again. A very, very laborious process, but it resulted in absolutely magnificent artistic creations. The most famous art work is La Belle Verrière, the Blue Virgin, which features the famous blue of Chartres. Just some examples of the spectacular rose windows and other stained glass windows. The detail, you can see where the details were painted on, whereas the big pieces were cut out. Copper roof was installed in 1837, following a fire not unlike the one at Notre-Dame de Paris in 2019. Reims Cathedral, the 4th cathedral built on the site. This is where Clovis was baptized in 496, and where most French kings have been crowned since 1017, including Charles VII, who had been accompanied there by Joan d'Arc, Joan of Arc. Another west facade on 4 levels with a Rayonnant rose glass windows. Again, it was redone at the end of the 14th century, like so many of these churches, redone in the Rayonnant style. There are different themes that were treated in the tympana above the portals, and this is fairly classic. The Passion of Christ on the left, the Virgin Mary in the center, and the Last Judgment on the right. You can see from this photo just how many sculptures there are, how many statues are on these Western portals alone. Well, it turns out that there are more statuary, there's more statuary at Reims than there is in any other cathedral in the world, with 2,300 sculptures in and on the cathedral. Elevation, the classic 3-level elevation of the Rayonnant period. 4-part rib vault with ribs leading to identical pillars. Here, the colonnettes don't go all the way to the ground as they did at Chartres. They stop at the capital And the arcade at Reims is incredibly high. The sense of verticality is really extraordinary. You can see how high the arcades are. Very unusually, this is looking at the west facade, and it's got not one, but two rose windows. Sadly, tragically, Reims found itself on the front line in World War I and was struck by over 300 artillery shells, which destroyed the roof, the vaults. But you can still see that the inside, remarkably, the pillars you can see still standing. The church was badly damaged, but thanks to the Rockefeller Foundation, it was restored during a 20-year campaign after World War I. The Amiens Cathedral, it's the largest church in France. It could fit 2 Notre-Dame de Paris inside it in terms of its square meters of space, cubic meters of space. West facade looks a little bit familiar after looking at the Reims facade. Same idea. You can see the jam statues on either side of the doors, the tympana, elaborate decorations. And the North Tower, we always know the one on the left is the north and the one on the right is the south because all these cathedrals were facing east. The North Tower in the Flamboyant style, the South Tower in the Rayonnant style. Grisaille was introduced at this time as well. Instead of having stained glass windows, grisaille, which were basically gray colored windows, somewhat time with tracery on them, but not much in the way of fancy designs. It was preferred in some churches because it allowed more light into the nave. And the church is also famous for its labyrinth. And the idea was that you would get on your knees and crawl the 768 feet to the center, which was supposed to represent Jerusalem. So this was a bit in lieu of a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. There are a number of churches that had labyrinths. Many of them were removed, as this one was too, but it was rebuilt at the end of the 19th century. This is a great shot simply because it shows you how, and this is true with, of course, every city in France, but how the cathedrals totally dominated every other building. You could see these structures from 10 miles away, if not more. Rouen, third church on the site. Famous for its towers, which of course, once again, were built at different periods. And they were the last thing to go up. You do the west facade, and then you would finally add the towers and then the steeples on top of the towers. And this one has a spectacular tower across the transept, the Lantern Tower, which was built only in 1822, and at nearly 500 feet is the highest spire in France. West facade, flamboyant style, as you can see, elaborate decoration. And it attracted the eye of the Impressionist painter Claude Monet, who rented an apartment across from the square and sat in the window and painted 30 paintings of the facade of Rouen Cathedral in the 1890s at different times of day. Tragically, the Allies bombed the cathedral by accident in the run-up to D-Day, but it was rebuilt later, considerably later, well, 10 years later. And for those of you in Chicago, the Chicago Tribune Tower was actually inspired by the Butter Tower of the Rouen Cathedral, with its flying buttresses at the top. The age of cathedral building came to a pretty abrupt halt with the arrival of Philippe IV le Bel, the Fair, on the throne of France, and his disputes with the papacy. I'll just mention two things. He was the one who arranged for Clement V, who was the first French pope, to be elected pope. And Clement was more or less in his pocket. Clement did not go to Rome. He established the Avignon papacy, which remained in Avignon until 1376, and was followed by the Great Schism, when there were rival popes in both Avignon and Rome. So we've talked about the high Gothic cathedrals, which reflect many other styles. Now we'll get back to the Rayonnant Gothic style and back to Paris and Saint Louis, who was the only king to become sainted shortly after he died. He spent 40,000 livres to build a chapel to house his reliquary, the relics of the crown of thorns and a piece of the true cross that he had bought for 130,000 livres. The Sainte-Chapelle was a royal chapel in the Palais de la Cité at the western end of the Ile de la Cité, and it is the epitome of Rayonnant Gothic style. One of the reasons why it's the epitome is because it was built over only 6 years. So it did not change style. It is all Rayonnant Gothic style. Of course, it's much smaller than a cathedral. It is a chapel. And it was built on 2 levels. The king and his family went to the upper level, and the other retainers went to the lower chapel, which was elaborately decorated with painting, the ceiling, the walls, some small windows in the apse. Columns were painted, fleur-de-lis everywhere. But the real action is on the upper chapel with its spectacular stained glass windows, 15 stained glass windows, 50 feet high, representing over 1,000 scenes from the Old and New Testaments. Go, if you can, on a sunny day so you get the full impact. Buy tickets in advance because there is always a long queue waiting to get in. You can very clearly see the flame-like tracery in this window around the glass. Sainte-Chapelle is famous for also for being one of 2 churches in Paris that's left with a so-called with a porch, and this is a 2-story porch, a covered entranceway. There's a Sainte-Chapelle in the illustrated text of the Duc de Berry. At the bottom here, with Notre-Dame at the top and a map of 1550. Its surroundings changed much over the period. So there are the arrows pointing to the chapel. The garden of the Palais de la Cité has now been made into the Place Dauphine in that triangular shape at the bottom. And then the Pont Neuf on the other side, both of which were built by Henry IV. This is a painting of Louis XIV visiting the Sainte-Chapelle. And it's now surrounded by the Palais de Justice with its 5th spire built by Viollet-le-Duc. This is what you see from the Rue de la Cité. As you walk in front of it, you've got the The Palace of Justice, which was built by Louis XVI at the end of the 18th century. And you can just make out the top of the Sainte-Chapelle on the left of it. And there it's totally surrounded. Haussmann completely redid the Palais de la Cité, transforming it into nothing but law courts, basically, with the exception of the conciergerie and a couple of other rooms, and the Sainte-Chapelle. So you have to go inside this courtyard, the Cour de la Sainte-Chapelle, in order to see it. So the fourth and final phase in the Gothic style is the flamboyant style, which is well represented by the Sainte-Chapelle de Vincennes. Which was built, the donjon, the keep, was built for defensive purposes, as you can see here. While this drawing is from the 17th century, the Tour de Vincennes was built by Charles V in the 14th century for defensive purposes. And the Sainte-Chapelle followed a good deal later. And you can see the tracery, once again, of the flamboyant Gothic style. The elaborate decoration that once was on the outside of the one door was destroyed in the Revolution, as was the interior decoration. So it's not as beautifully furnished and all that. It is no longer in its, but it's a pure representation of this flamboyant style of architecture. And it includes stained glass windows in a new style, the Renaissance style, which is very different from the medieval style that we saw at Chartres, because they made it in a simpler, faster, cheaper way. The pot metal glass style of Chartres was used in the 12th and 13th centuries, and then they switched to something called the flash glass process in the 14th century, where a clear piece of glass, it could be colored, but a clear piece of glass would be dropped into a colored coating, then cooled, and then etched to expose the color beneath, if there was a color beneath. Faster and cheaper than the old method, to be sure, but not and more realistic. But I think you'll agree it's not as spectacular as the pot metal method of stained glass of the 12th and 13th centuries. So the 100 Years' War slowed church building. That was also going on. As I mentioned I should have said as well, it wasn't just Philip IV. But three other churches that were built around after the 100 Years' War that you all, as visitors of Paris, will be familiar with. The Église Saint-Séverin, rebuilt in the flamboyant Gothic style. There are the flames around the windows. 3-story elevation. It's most famous for its choir and its so-called twisted pillar, pilier tour, which sprouts 14 ribs in the shape of a palm tree. Wonderful shape in what is called the Palmeraie, the palm grove in the Alps. This is the eastern end. And those peaked buildings to the left are burial vaults. It's the last ossuary in Paris. The Église Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, it truly is a composite of styles. Romanesque bell tower, Rayonnant choir, flamboyant porch, Renaissance portal. When you look at it from the street, that is not the church's bell tower. Church's bell tower is on the right arrow there. In fact, the one that people think is the church's bell tower was only built in 1865 by the architect Théodore Ballou, who also built the the town hall of the first arrondissement. In order to balance out the square, he more or less built another pseudo church, which is the secular version of what's on the right. And in the middle, to balance it out, he built the tower. And it is that tower that signaled St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in August 2023, which we will be talking about next week. In addition to the Sainte-Chapelle, this is the other church that has a porch in the Flamboyant Gothic style. Église Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie, built in the Flamboyant Gothic style as late as 1509. So the first churches we talked about, Saint-Denis, was started in 1130. Now we're still nearly 300 years later, and we're still building, nearly 400 years later, still building churches in the style, but it has evolved. This is the starting point for pilgrimage to Saint-Jacques de Compostelle. And as we will discover in 2 weeks, the church no longer exists, but the tower does, the Tour Saint-Jacques. And the Église Saint-Merri, which is located near Les Halles, in the pedestrian street area of the Rue Saint-Martin. The north side, which usually you look at from this distance on the other side of the Fontaine Stravinsky, next to the Centre Pompidou, with sculptures by Jean Tinguely, which are the dark ones, the mechanical ones, and his wife, Niki de Saint-Phal, which are the colorful, fantastic figure ones. West facade in the Flamboyant Gothic style with statues of apostles that were only added in the 19th century. Nave with quadripartite vaults, rectangular pillars without capitals. And here the stained glass windows were removed in 1741 to provide more light. So that wraps it up today. Abbot Suger's Saint-Denis Basilica inspired the building of 180 Gothic cathedrals throughout France and Europe, possibly the apex of church building. Next week, we will move from the Gothic period, illustrated by Notre-Dame on the left, to the Baroque period, passing through the Renaissance period to the Baroque period, illustrated by the dome church of the Invalides on the right. So I hope you tune in next week. Voila.
Well, Russell, thank you so much for this presentation. There's so many things in there. I can't believe those churches that look so fragile, so slender, were also so tough. I mean, all the ones that got hit by bombs and most still partly standing. The beauty, of course, of the stained glass. I think there's a whole series there to learn more about stained glass, how it evolves around during time, what they represent. Of course, I love the height, the light, and the fact that all these churches were immortalized by a more contemporary painter like Claude Monet. Thank you for mentioning that. I think that's one of his most beautiful series. Well, if you are ready, we have a few questions, and I invite people to put their question, if possible, in the Q&A box, because that makes it a little easier for us to find your question and be able to pass them on to Russell. And should it be a question that Russell might not be able to answer, and if anybody listening has some information about these, don't hesitate to talk to us through the chat line, okay? Because I know a question here, the first one that I will ask, I'm not exactly sure of the answer myself. So I will ask Russell. This is from Craig Baskin, who says that last week, you think you said the churches were maintained by the cities in France and the cathedrals by the French state. So his question is Is this also true for Protestant churches, synagogues, and mosques in France?
I believe so. I frankly, I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think they would make a distinction. The French state is as I will talk about on the second to last lecture, there's a law of secularization, separation of church and state in 1905. And I believe that they did not distinguish between Catholic churches and any other churches.
Very good. And that is very representative of the French Republic. We also have a question from Stephen Betancourt. Are there any instances that you might know of problem solving during construction, or perhaps major problems while they were under construction? For instance, catastrophic failure or unique solution. So any anecdote that you might be aware of around the construction, which I believe took place over many, many years, of those cathedral, the Gothic style cathedral?
Yes, I can give a pretty good anecdote, which is during that age of cathedrals that I was describing, there was basically it was a competition. Every church, every city wanted to have its cathedral bigger and higher and better than the last one. And back then, I mean, there were not architects, there were builders. And there were not precise rules that were applied by these builders. It was a lot of it was learned by trial and error. And one of those errors happened in the Cathedral of Beauvais. Beauvais is about 50 miles north of Paris, and it featured a spectacular cathedral, and it was destined to be the highest cathedral of them all. There are many ways to measure height. Building spires is one way, but probably a better, an even more impressive criterion is the interior height. Because when you go into these Gothic cathedrals, it's quite overwhelming, frankly, when you go into some of them and you see just how high they are. And Beauvais wanted to make sure that they had the highest nave and choir in France, in the world. And they built, and their goal was to get to 50 meters. And they actually did build vaults that were 50 meters high, which is about 500 feet. Sorry, that's wrong. It's about 160 feet high. And so it collapsed. So that they reached their limit. The speculation was, how high can you go with these vaults? Just how high can you go? And the answer was 50 meters. So they ended up rebuilding the vaults at 48.5 meters, and they stabilized, and that converts to 156 feet. And the Beauvais choir is the highest interior space of a church in France. It set them back so much that they never got around to building the nave, actually. So it's a very truncated church. You see the choir and the transepts without a nave.
Well, that's a good story indeed. I saw a question a bit earlier, and so they have Beauvais as the highest nave, but what is the highest cathedral, if you count also the spire, in France?
Well, the highest cathedral in France, the highest spire in France is Rouen, with its iron steeple that was built over the lantern tower, it was called, that was built over the transept, but only in 1822. So it's a little bit cheating because they were using, different materials. It wasn't stone, but it's the highest. It's 495 feet tall, which interestingly is not quite half as tall, nearly half as tall as the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower is twice as big as the highest cathedral's spire in France, but it is not the highest spire in the world, just France. The highest spire in the world is actually in Germany, in which is another 30 feet higher than the one in France. So that's the highest one in France, in Europe, and in fact the world, but that's not all that surprising. But that's also interesting because indeed, as I said in my last slide, the French style of Gothic architecture spread. It wasn't just in France, and it spread to England famously. There are all sorts of Gothic cathedrals there, and each country had its own take on them. And there's some spectacular Gothic cathedrals, God knows, in France and Germany in particular. Also, not so much in Italy because they, as I said at the very beginning, they disparaged the Gothic style, and they had different building materials. They had a lot of marble, for example. So a lot of their cathedrals, even the Gothic ones, are made of marble, whereas the French ones are made of calcaire. What is that? Limestone.
I can't help you with that one.
Limestone.
Calcaire.
Limestone.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Limestone.
That's a more porous and lighter.
Well, that's actually another interesting point. I know from talking to a stonemason who was out on the property of Notre-Dame this summer talking about the restoration of Notre-Dame. I had no idea, but it turns out that there are different qualities of stone. So if you get limestone that is too porous, it will not be able to support weight. So you need to get an extremely dense type of limestone to put in the load-bearing parts of the cathedral. Then you can use the more porous, less strong stone for decorative elements and so on.
Oh. Well, I'm glad you were able to have those conversations just as you were visiting all those cathedrals. Well, quite a few questions, but while we're on this, and this is a personal question, I was wondering how many cathedrals did you visit this summer, and if you have a personal favorite?
Well, my wife Lynn and I have visited three in France and a couple in Germany this summer. We went to Strasbourg, which is an amazing cathedral. I recommend it. It's got a spectacular steeple, which is the second tallest, I think, in Europe, in France. But it was interesting it's kind of cheating to include it in the list of French cathedrals because Strasbourg did not, or Alsace did not become part of France until 1682. So when the cathedral was built, it was part of the free imperial, it was a free imperial city, more closely attached to the Habsburg Empire than it was to France. So, you got to take those sorts of things into consideration. We went to Rouen, which is absolutely spectacular, mind-boggling. But the one that I have to say was our favorite was Chartres. And we went there twice, actually. Why? Because the first, we happened to be going to Le Perche twice and Chartres on the way. And the first time we went there, we checked out the cathedral and we discovered to our amazement that the famous English guide, Malcolm Miller, was still in business. Now, Malcolm Miller has been giving tours of Chartres Cathedral for 60 years.
Wow.
And when we moved to France in 1987, he was the guy to go to because he knew more about Chartres than anybody. And I thought I'd, missed my chance when we went there this summer, but son of a gun, if he is still not giving tours. So we went back a second time to have him give us a tour. And he's the guy that talks about the stained glass windows. He knows everything there is to know about the stained glass windows of Chartres.
Wow, it sounds like it's really worth the detour just to hear someone talk beautifully. We know when a guide it can make such a big difference. Okay, we have other questions. Lots of them actually you answered by talking about your take on the cathedral, but let's see. Did you read Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth?
Yeah, I read, I think, one or two. I certainly read one. I may have read two, but it's so long ago, I really don't remember.
Okay, because the question from Marilyn was, what do you think of cathedral building as described by Ken Follett? Did you think it was accurate or just entertaining? And I think there's actually also a TV series that was made based on it.
Well, I believe that Ken Follett did his homework, and probably it's accurate in terms of what he said about how you go about building the cathedrals and how you had to have the artisans, the specialists, the craftsmen from every the carpenters, the stonemasons, the sculptors, and all of that under the control of a master builder. So I'm sure it was quite accurate. What I really haven't had the time to figure out where the English, how different their cathedrals are from the French ones. But I do remember that, of course, the guy who stars in the Pillars of the Earth, the first one, went to France and got his inspiration there, as did so many other countries.
Mhm. There was a question for Pauline, but I think you answered because she was asking you about the type of stone. So we went over this, le calcaire, so limestone, and if marble was used, and you mentioned that's more like in Italy. And she also asked if steel was ever used as a hidden reinforcement in later restorations.
You bet.
You bet, huh? Yeah. I thought so too.
In 3 weeks, I'll be talking about the 19th century churches, and that changed everything because they were built with steel structures, and all of a sudden with steel you didn't need flying buttresses, for example. They were perfectly strong in their own right. They could hold up anything. And certainly for repair work, for example, I mentioned the cathedral at Beauvais. There are lots of steel supports that have been put in there to keep the damn thing from falling down. But no, the steel was not used as a building material until the 19th century.
Then Susan did ask about architect and engineer to building the cathedrals, and you told us that actually there were no architect, and it was more like those master builder. And Mia is asking, what do you think is the reason for the difference between the French and Northern churches' embrace of the Gothic style as opposed to Italy's resistance to it? And I think you explained it through the fact that they didn't have the same material, maybe, or a material that was not really appropriate for that type of architecture. And did differences in theological emphasis have anything to do with it?
Well, certainly not until Martin Luther showed up. It's because there was only one Christian religion until Martin Luther started protesting, and that predates the ones that we've been talking about. Sorry, that was after the period that we're talking about. But I'll be talking about the Protestant Reformation next week. But my focus is basically on the Catholic churches, I have to say. So I think the Northern European ones were just that much further from Italy, so they were more and closer to France, so they would be more subject to French influence. Also, as I mentioned last week, France and Paris. Paris was the biggest city in the biggest country in Europe, so its influence was dramatic. The Renaissance, as we will talk about next week, started in Italy and worked its way north. And the Gothic bit started in France and worked its way north as well.
Une architecture rayonnante. Pauline says also that maybe one thing that impacted the difference between Italy and France was the light. She says that the decoration of the Gothic style works better in the gray light of France versus the clarity of the Italian work. So that's interesting that light might be influencing some choices in architecture, and it would make perfect sense. Now, maybe I'll go to one of my last questions from Lynn Kelley, who asked, I wonder if that's a trick question, Russell, was the earlier church in front of Notre-Dame, St. Stephen's, used in the building of Notre-Dame?
Yes. So
can you explain? Because for me, it's confusing a little bit, but please expand on this.
Okay. Well, last week I showed an illustration that showed that there is Saint-Étienne, which was built in the 6th century, in front of Notre-Dame today. And they started building Notre-Dame at the eastern end, and they started taking down Saint-Étienne as they went, and they reused the stones that were in the Saint-Étienne church to build Notre-Dame until finally it was all gone. So yeah.
Reusing, recycling, very good practice. One last question before we're probably going to have to close this lecture. A question from Alison who asked if grout was used between the stones in those Gothic cathedrals, or is it just stone on stone, like a complete fit? It's a technical question.
I don't know.
Okay, we'll look into it. We'll look into it. If someone knows, you're welcome to put it on the chat there or in the Q&A boxes. As I know, many architects are very fond of this series, Russell. Like we met some yesterday who said they love it so much. It's a nice couple. He's an architect. They have the American. They have a house in Paris or an apartment in Paris, and they say we've visited all those churches. So it's like coming back home for them. So I thought I'd pass this on. But I think this is coming to a close. And all I want to say is thank you to everybody who was attending today. Of course, a mega thank you to Russell for all the research and the time he spends in the summer bringing this together and sharing it with us. Also, a big thank you to all our partners, to Megan from the American Association of Women in Europe, a group we did not know so much about, and we know more now. Thank you to the team in Miami. Thank you to the team here in Chicago supporting the program. And I will say, let's meet again next week. And that will be Thursday, January 26th for the Renaissance churches and the Baroque churches of the Counter-Reformation. The shining example that Russell provided is Les Invalides. So on this, au revoir, bonne fin de journée. Merci beaucoup, Russell, et à bientôt.
Au revoir.